Story recap here. Today I'm going to explain a comedy and fantasy film called Down to Earth. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. Lance Barton is a bicycle messenger who dreams of becoming a comedian. After working one day, Lance goes to the Apollo Theater, where he hopes to successfully perform in front of a real audience. Lance is nervous and tries to get reassurance from Whitney Daniels, his manager, that he won't be booed off like last time, but the man just says anything can happen. Unfortunately, the people hate his performance, and in the end, he's forced to go home. After the show, Lance goes to a diner with Whitney, who says he's funny off stage. Whitney says Lance is afraid of being himself on stage, and people can see that. Then, Phil Kwan, another comedian, approaches Lance and tells him to ignore the crowd, adding that he's a funny man. Once Phil is gone, Whitney informs Lance that the Apollo Theater is shutting down and will do a farewell show with 5 slots for amateurs. Lance then asks his manager to get him a slot, but Whitney wants him to let it go and try someplace else. However, Lance is determined to change his bad reputation, saying as long as he's called Bowie at the Apollo, he'll be Bowie everywhere. On his way home, Lance gets distracted when he sees a beautiful woman, Santi Jenkins, and gets hit by a truck. Keys, an angel, is already waiting for him, and he immediately takes Lance to heaven. There, Lance finds it hard to believe that he's dead. Keys and King try to explain to him what happened, but Lance refuses to listen and says he has an audition coming up. He also tells him to fix whatever mistake they made and get him home. Exasperated, Keys instructs Serge to check the list and see when Lance is arriving. Then, the guy tells them Lance is supposed to die on November 17, 2044. So Keys admits he took him 1/10 of a second before the truck hit. King is upset that Keys made a mistake, and Lance can't help but get mad at him for killing him. Afterward, King takes care of Lance's case since he is the angel in charge of deciding who will go to heaven and hell. However, because Lance's body is already gone, God allowed King to put the comedian in someone else's body as long as no one knows that person is already dead. They then leave to find a body, and they end up at the house of the 15th richest man in America, Charles Wellington. There, they see Mrs. Wellington and Charles' private secretary, Sklar. The two are talking about killing Charles, so Lance tries telling the housekeepers, Wanda and Rosa, to call the police. However, the women can't see him. Moments later, while Mrs. Wellington and Sklar are fooling around, the butler, Cisco, informs him that Santi is there to see them. Santi immediately enters the house and tells them they should be arrested for what they're planning to do to the Brooklyn Community Hospital. At the same time, Santi refuses to leave until she talks to Charles about the privatization of the public hospital, so she cuffs herself to the table. Upon witnessing everything, Lance decides to take Charles' body to help Santi. A few seconds later, Lance and King teleport to the bathroom, where they find Charles' dead body in the bathtub. However, Lance only wants to take the body on loan, and since the angels made a mistake, King promises he'll find a better body for Lance. Then, Lance finally takes the old man's body, but King reminds him that he looks and sounds like Charles to everyone. When Lance opens the door, he asks Cisco where his clothes are and immediately gets dressed. Of course, Mrs. Wellington and Sklar can't believe what they're seeing, but Lance decides to deal with them later. He then talks to an upset Santi, who says she'll bring every news reporter she can find to Charles' board of directors meeting on Monday. After that, Lance helps Santi with her handcuffs after accidentally dropping the key, and the woman finally leaves. Meanwhile, Mrs. Wellington and Sklar discuss how they blew their chance to kill Charles. However, they just end up making out on the pool table, and when Lance walks in on them, he tells them he knows what they did. But despite that, Lance says he wants them all to move on, and he asks Sklar if he knows how to get in touch with Santi because he wants to ask her on a date. Later on, Lance explores the house and asks the housekeepers how he can watch Bet or Black Entertainment Television. Wanda tells him he can use a TV in the staff lounge, so Lance thanks her and quickly heads there. However, Lance hears the housekeepers saying mean things about Charles, which makes him decide to give them a 200% raise. Outside the door, Lance hears Cisco talk talking with an American accent. He then asks the butler about it, and he doesn't believe it when Cisco insists he's from London. Lance thinks Cisco is faking his accent to make rich folks feel comfortable, but he doesn't really care about that and just wants to watch TV while drinking beer. Moments later, Lance takes the car with Cisco and heads to Comedy Shack. There, they watch a great comedian, Joe Guy, make the audience laugh, and it isn't long before Lance also performs. Unfortunately, the people don't find Lance funny, and all they see is an old white man talking about persons of color. Days pass, and Lance continues living as Charles. At the same time, he tries to ask Santi on a date, but the woman just ignores his calls and refuses to accept the flowers he sent her. Eventually, Lance decides to wait for Santi outside her house and asks her out, saying they can discuss the whole hospital thing. Sadly, Santi just tells him to do something positive with his money before leaving. Seconds later, King shows up and informs Lance he's working on getting him a new body. Cisco watches Lance, but to him, it looks like his boss is talking to himself. Meanwhile, Mrs. Wellington breaks up with Sklar and says she'll do whatever she can to get her husband back. Before the meeting, Lance faces the angry people being threatened to be kicked out of the hospital. Then, Lance invites everyone to the meeting and informs them he'll do everything he can to help the sick and the poor. The directors can't believe what they're hearing, but Lance just continues to say they have to be different and proudly leaves. At home, Mrs. Wellington tries to use her charm on Lance, but Lance is just not interested. Then, he welcomes Santi when she shows up at his house, telling her to call him Lance. Santi thanks Lance for everything he said at the board meeting, and they go to a diner to get something to eat. The two of them talk about random stuff, and Santi finds herself having a good time. However, it confuses Santi to see and hear Lance rap, but the comedian just continues what he's doing. Unfortunately, one of the customers gets pissed and punches Lance, knocking him out. Once Lance regains consciousness, he says he forgot who he was. Santi then tells Lance she sees someone inside him, admitting that she finds it crazy. After that, Lance and Santi continue their date, but their day soon comes to an end. Lance walks Santi home, and after kissing her, he happily goes home. Meanwhile, Keys goes to a bar to wait for the next person who will go to heaven. Then, he quickly informs Lance he got a new body for him, but Lance is already happy using Charles. He says Santi only knows him as Charles and doesn't want to change anymore, ignoring Keys' protests. At the same time, Lance suddenly chases the guy trying to rob him, leaving a frustrated Keys behind. The next day, Sklar informs the directors of Charles' firm that the old man wants to be more involved in running the company. The directors are worried they might lose a few $1,000,000, and one of them jokingly says they should just kill Charles, but as it turns out, he's actually serious, and another director tells Sklar to handle the situation. Concurrently, Whitney visits Lance after being contacted by Cisco. Lance attempts to convince Whitney that he was the young comedian he was trying to help, saying he got hit by a truck and went up to heaven. Lance desperately explains to Whitney how he lost his body, but the manager doesn't believe him and prepares to leave. However, Whitney stops when Lance starts talking about their gig in Atlantic City, making him realize that the guy is telling the truth. That night, Whitney takes Lance to a comedy bar, where he successfully performs in front of an audience. After that, Lance continues working on his act and even receives help from Santi. Then, Lance tells Santi about his plan to perform at the Apollo Theater, so the woman points out that what he said at the meeting was funny and unique. Back at home, Mrs. Wellington tries everything to get Lance's attention. Unfortunately, Lance only asks for a divorce since he already likes someone else. Lance tells her she can have the house and car, saying he doesn't want them, but Mrs. Wellington thinks he's lost his mind. One night, Charles performs at the comedy club he just bought while the judges from the Apollo Theater watch. Sad to say, one of the men in the audience doesn't find Lance funny and eagerly mocks him, but Lance refuses to be intimidated. Then, Lance finally makes the people laugh, and he starts talking about how poor his family was when he was a kid. Afterward, Lance is happy to learn that he got the last spot for the Apollo Theater's final show. Meanwhile, Wanda and Rosa get the raise they deserve, and they can't help but like their boss. Then, Lance throws a party for the patients of the Brooklyn Community Hospital, ignoring the frustrated directors. At the same time, Lance asks Santi to marry him, saying he'd give up everything he has just to be with her. However, Key shows up from afar and calls Lance, Lance, so he tells Santi he'll be right back. Unfortunately, Lance is unaware that there's a sniper nearby. Keys tells Lance he needs to come with him because he can't stay in Charles' body, but the comedian just asks him to leave. Then, he returns to where Santi is and says he really wants to get married, adding that he doesn't want her to forget him. Confused, Santi starts thinking that something bad is about to happen, but Lance assures her everything is fine before walking away to talk to Keys and King. King reminds Lance he has to play by the rules like everybody else, but Lance tells the angel he played by the rules all his life. Lance also hates it that they're ruining everything when he's finally happy, so King points out that using Charles' body is a temporary setup. Then, Lance gets shot, and Sklar casually eats as he leaves. Unfortunately, the reason the angels are trying to get Lance to come with them is because of what will happen to Charles. And now, Lance can only hope that they will give him one more chance to live. Once the ambulance and cops arrive, Whitney tries to comfort Santi. At the same time, King shows Lance the comedian named Joe Guy, whose body he's supposed to use next. Then, Joe gets into an accident when his tires blow out because of some broken bottles on the road, and Lance immediately takes over his body. That night, Santi watches the news about Charles' killing and learns that Sklar is being questioned about his boss's death. She also finds out that Charles left the bulk of his estate to city charities, his personal friends, and loyal staff. Then, the show at the Apollo Theater finally starts, and Whitney can't help but ask Phil if he's Lance. However, Whitney doesn't realize that Lance is inside Joe's body, and Lance makes the audience laugh by saying looks will determine everything in a person's life. Seconds later, it finally dawns on Whitney that Lance is the one on stage, relieved that his friend is back. Eventually, Lance finishes his act and hugs Whitney, and he can't help but feel glad that the people didn't boo him off. After the show, King and Keys congratulate Lance for doing a great job. King also tells Lance that Joe's body is now permanently his, but King says Lance won't remember anything about them once they leave, and he'll forget Charles and Santi too. As if that isn't enough, Lance won't remember that he's actually Lance Barton, for he has to live as Joe Guy. Of course, Lance is worried that Santi won't recognize him, but King assures him everything will be okay. Moments later, Lance is approached by Whitney and gets confused when the manager calls him Lance. He says his name is Joe Guy, making Whitney realize his friend is gone. Then, Lance asks Whitney if he can be his manager, and the man happily says it's okay with him. On his way home, Lance bumps into Santi, who asks where she can find Whitney. Then, after telling her where to find Whitney, Lance wonders if they know each other. Lance introduces himself to Santi as Joe Guy, and gets a strange feeling when he hears her name, offering to go with her to look for Whitney when the lights go out. He then assures her that everything is fine, making Santi remember Lance. The two of them decide to grab something to eat, and the more Lance speaks, the more Santi remembers the guy she likes. Then, Santi shares that she now owns a community hospital, and they're soon picked up by Cisco and Wanda. However, they almost get hit by a truck, so Lance switches places with Cisco and drives. Meanwhile, the angels witness the entire thing, frustrating King and making him tell Keys to keep an eye on Lance. Back in the car, Lance plays some music, and they all sing a hip-hop song.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.